Well, good morning. Good morning from Neffsville. Sunday, January the 9th, 2022. And it's funny, last week, of course, I had some criticism for the experience of couch church, but yet here we are today. And strange day trying to get centered on the camera. I did shave and put on a shirt, but I'm also in sweats and socks, so it's a strange day. But I think a good morning to stay off the roads. Not much happening here yet as I record this. We'll see how long it takes to upload. No PowerPoint today since that would involve editing, but you can always rewind me if you miss a reference. So we're talking about Advent for the month of January. Advent means the arrival of a notable person or thing or event, which is how it came to be associated with Christmas. It's commonly what we think of when we think of Advent. Now, in this series, we're talking about Advent in recognition of the arrival of another significant thing, a new year. And what this really comes down to is I've been wrestling with some things that I think sometimes get discussed during the holidays and then sort of quickly forgotten. And you know what? Since I'm wrestling with them, you get to wrestle along with me, or not. That's really up to you. So last week we talked about making all of life, not just Christmas, about worshiping fully, having a more worshipful experience, a more worshipful existence. Worship in the sense of an activity, which is our need to connect, or for some of us to reconnect to the gathering of believers in our kingdom community here at Conestoga Valley Church of Christ, because quite a few of us have been away from this community for an extended period due to COVID. And worship also in the larger sense of an attitude that lives as though life itself is worship, and that finds expression in things like we talked about last week, things like but not limited to showing more gratitude as we go through life, celebrating more as we go through life, setting aside more downtime in life, inspired by the concept of Sabbath. And so here we are today. I was thinking about Christmas. I don't know about what you did for Christmas gifts this year. I gave a very nice, very expensive gift to myself. I gave myself a new hot water heater for Christmas. It wasn't really in the plan, but those things happen. I came back from Tennessee to discover that I had no hot water, and so there you go. And I was joking with someone about how part of being an adult is the reality that very frequently you spend, let's call it significant money, on things that do exactly the same thing as whatever it was that they replaced. Hot water heaters, certainly like that. HVAC equipment. Tires, one of my favorites. And basically, any major appliance, especially a kitchen appliance, wouldn't it be great if, you replace those things, and as part of getting a new one, you got some cool new function that you can sort of get a little excited about, but that usually is not the case. The flip side of that, though, was, the realization of how incredibly fortunate I am and how incredibly fortunate I think most of us are. If you live in America in 2022, you almost certainly have hot water, and you probably don't give it a thought, let alone, the idea of having running water in general. If you live in America today, you have electricity. You have some form of heat in wherever you're living. You probably have air conditioning. You most likely have reliable internet. Those things are still not a given in large parts of the world. And to be fair, not a given for everyone, even in our country, but largely true for most of our citizens. And so add to that all the technology we have. We have televisions and telephones and computer games, and I think almost all of us have at least one car in our family unit, and most of us have more than one. Even more basic, and not to ignore the very serious problem of hunger in America. That's a bigger problem than most of us probably realize. We may not all be eating steak, but most of us have enough food to eat. And many of us, let's face it, many of us also manage to afford not just to feed our families, but to feed an animal or two. And so, on and on I could go. All that to say, I really don't need very much that I don't already have. Do you? I mean, really? Is there some significant area of your life where you truly need something that you're just really struggling to get? It does happen, and I certainly don't want to make light of it. It may be happening to you. I do know, I've known people through the years, and some now, who are sort of struggling to keep clothing on their children. They're relying on hand-me-downs and the kindness of other people to do that, and it's a very real thing. If your car fails right now, you might have a tough time, replacing it affordably. Bad time to buy a car. Just incredibly expensive to begin with, and even more so now. Sometimes, we might face a health issue where they tell us technology says, well, here's something that might cure this, but it's so expensive and insurance might not cover it, and so it might be out of your reach financially. But for most of us, day to day, we have far more than we really need. And yet, I don't know if you notice, I don't think it's just me, we keep buying stuff we don't need. One of the things that we're perhaps more conscious of during the Christmas season is the temptation of consumerism. This is just basically the idea that purchasing goods and services, consuming goods and services, more goods and services, is essentially always a good thing. That's sort of the idea behind consumerism. And even more, by extension, the idea that somehow my well-being, my happiness depends on my consumption. It depends on getting more stuff, consuming more stuff. And I think our awareness of this sometimes is elevated at Christmas because we're confronted with unusual things, things that are not in our routine. We have these extra extensive gift lists. We have these holiday events. We have travel, and they strain our resources. They strain our budgets. They often cause us to go into debt. I know some of us just dread those, those we joke about, and dread those January credit card bills. At the same time, as that's all going on, we're also challenged with some of the deeper meaning behind the holiday, and things about faith and about family and about traditions. And so there's a tension there, even if we sometimes try to kind of put it out of our heads so that we can enjoy the season. And then, the holidays are over. It's January 9th. And so you think, well, I'm past all that. But are we? I think for a lot of us, we're still sort of routinely out there scanning Amazon, looking for some good deal because we like how it feels when we get a package on our doorstep. Or we go to the store and we're reminded already that even though it's January 9th and we're having an ice storm out there, we need to upgrade our clothes to get ready for summer vacations now. Or, maybe this is just me. You're out there scanning headlines on the tech pages or watching YouTube videos from all the tech conferences that start to happen around the beginning of the year. And you very quickly are reminded that whatever gadgets you have, even if they're fairly current, they're already, outdated. It's time for an upgrade. Consumerism is kind of crafty like that. It plays with our tendency toward discontent, and I think it uses boredom as a tool. We're vulnerable to the lies that it tells us. And I think including and not limited to ideas like this. I need to spend in order to help keep the economy strong so that people will have jobs. And so in a sense, that lie, I believe that's a lie, but it frames consumerism as, my patriotic duty. And boy, that's a powerful button to push for some of us, right? If it's about patriotism, we're there. We want to do what's patriotic. We like how that makes us feel. And yet, this lie leads to waste. It leads to overconsumption. It leads to a thirst for, cheap goods made in shady places under questionable conditions. This lie is why I have a basement full of stuff that I never use. This lie is why our houses keep getting bigger and bigger as our families keep getting smaller, and why we have garages that we can't seem to find space in for our cars, and why we spend money to rent storage units for stuff that we don't use and can't fit in our bigger houses with garages full of stuff instead of cars. In Genesis chapter 2, God gives man the responsibility for being what we often call stewards of the earth. It's not the term that he actually uses there, but it's the idea behind it. And so he puts man in the garden to, as it says in Genesis 2, to work it and take care of it, meaning that it's here for our use, but not for our abuse or our misuse. If you dig a little, you quickly see that waste is damaging to this world that God created. And so it's not patriotic, it's poor stewardship. Or here's another lie. My worth is in what I own, or it's in how much money I have. And it's sister lie. I think these are related. I have to try to keep up with everyone else, to be like everyone else. And this is probably passed into, um, it's probably out of trend now, but FOMO, the idea of fear of missing out, which even if it's not something we say anymore, is still a real thing. That plays into this as well. This is the core message of so much of the marketing that's aimed at us. Why? Because it works. It gets us to buy stuff. It gets us to buy into stuff. Yet my worth, my value should come from being made in God's image, from being made by God into a co-heir with Jesus of all the great gifts of his kingdom, of having a place in God's kingdom. That's where my worth should come from. Here's another lie. Owning more things will make my life easier. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't think there's anything wrong with working smart, with being efficient, but having as your main goal, I want to have a life of ease. It's not much of a goal. And besides, this is an area I think in which we often get overpromised. I mean, our lives are easier by I would almost say every measure. Our lives are easier than at any time in human history. We have it easier. We have more things done for us, more conveniences, more leisure time, more vacation time than any other people who have ever existed. And yet all sorts of other issues, anxiety and depression and suicide and addiction and violence are on the rise. That's not what was supposed to happen when life got easier. Or here's another lie. Having all the latest and the best things, or just having more of them, is going to make me happy. And yet, it rarely does, right? I mean, when's the last time you bought something that really made a significant difference in your life? I'll tell you, probably the closest I can come to recently is sometime last year, I bought an air fryer. That's pretty cool, and I actually use it. But I have to say, there's a whole bunch of other stuff tucked away in the back of kitchen cabinets or in my basement, or stuff I've already gotten rid of, that are kitchen gadgets that I bought and that did not deliver. And that has been by far a more common experience. And so at best, we quickly pass into the phase of, even if we use them, of taking them for granted, like a lot of other things in our lives. And then we move on because we need another thrill. And that's the fleeting nature of happiness derived from our stuff, in contrast to, the everlasting joy of the Lord. Let me pause here very quickly and remind us, because I don't think I've said this. I want to just emphasize that this whole discussion is about looking inward. And I bring that up because it's very easy to think about these things and to use them to evaluate other people, because to some extent I can see if in my mind you don't have a good handle on consumerism in your life by looking at your life and deciding, well, here's a reasonable kind of car, but you drive a nicer car, or here's a reasonable neighborhood to live in, but your house is bigger and fancier. And so we can do that with other people, and that's not worth much. We shouldn't. That's not what this point is about. This is not a tool to judge others. I have a vivid memory. I laugh about it. But a vivid memory of early on in the first couple of years I was preaching, when our church was smaller and our auditorium was laid out a little differently. And I used to stand at a podium that clipped on the back of our pews. We had pews then, and I would stand down on the floor. And so I was kind of down in the middle of, at least at the front, but real close to the people in the audience. And one Sunday, I don't remember the exact topic, but I was trying to make a point that in America, basically, by the standards of the world, we are wealthy. And I wasn't saying that was a bad thing. It's one of the things that you benefit from being in America. But I was trying to make that point. And so I was listing some things that we think of as normal, but that are a sign of wealth. And so I was talking about how, I have a machine that cleans my dishes, and I have a machine that washes my clothes and all that. And at one point I mentioned that, this was fairly early in the cell phone era, but I mentioned that between the phones I had in my office at home, and an upstairs phone, a downstairs phone, my wife and I each had a cell phone. I've got 5 telephones in my house. And I remember so vividly because somebody down in front, sitting a couple rows back in one of the pews, leaned over to their spouse and whispered very loudly, and I believe then and believe now with the intent that I would hear it, "What does he need with 5 phones?" And trust me, I heard it. And it was funny, and yet that person was also kind of missing the point. It's easy to see in others what we don't see in ourselves. And instead, we need to look in all situations, and certainly in this conversation, we need to look in the mirror. But what if, as we looked in the mirror, if as we looked inward, each of us decided to spend less? It would take some work, it would take some effort. But what if we really looked at where our money was going? And if we decided to lay our finances before God and to really focus on gratitude and contentment and to really take a stand against waste? What if? Fundamentally, I think that this is an underrated practice on our path to discipleship as we strive to become more like Jesus. Because, the scriptures tell us some things about this. They tell us, for one, that God values contentment in his kingdom. He has given us the witness of Scripture from Genesis through Revelation and well into our lives 2,000 years after the Scriptures are not being written anymore. We know and are made aware of God's breathtaking, spectacular blessings. And yet we also know that, occasionally God looks at our attitudes, he looks at our actions, and sometimes he is grieved. And I think it's got to hurt when God looks down on us or God looks out at us and sees that despite all he's done for us, we often just seem to be looking for more. We just want more. And we're often looking in lesser places. In fact, if we're looking anywhere other than from God, we're looking in lesser places. 1 Timothy 6, Paul writes, starting in verse 6, he says, godliness with contentment is great gain. He reminds us that we brought nothing into the world, we can take nothing out of it. He says, if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. Are we really? And then there's this warning that's well known and well respected, or should be well respected, well considered. Those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For, here's the money quote, for the love of money. The love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. When we decide to spend less, we demonstrate contentment in a tangible way, in a practical way. It's a measure of self-control, which, remember, is a fruit of the Spirit. It's a measure of self-control that can help us avoid the pitfalls and the temptations that accompany what is a necessary use of money. We have to have money to live and survive in our culture, in our world. But this demonstrates self-control, and God is pleased with that. Another thing I think that we see in Scripture is that willingly spending less by choice, consciously, is a sign that we might be at least attempting to refocus our worship on the right things. Because consumerism is a form of worship. It is a form of enslavement. Spending less is one indicator that we have a deeper trust in, a deeper relationship with God, as we accept and we live by his promises. Because lack of contentment is really at its core a faith issue. In Hebrews 13, verse 5, the Hebrew writer says, keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have. Why? He doesn't say why, but why? You're asking because God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. We can depend on God. We can't depend on stuff. None of it. And then, yes, spending less will free up resources. It'll free up resources to do other things that might have a greater impact for the kingdom. A greater impact than whatever it was that I was going to do with yet another pair of shoes. Or some new golf clubs that really are not going to improve my game that much, if at all, and that, frankly, I don't have time to use anyway. Or the latest video game that plays pretty much exactly like the last version of that video game that I already have. Jesus himself reminds us in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 6, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Spending less helps us align our actions with what we say are our values. So, that's some of the theological basis for spending less. How we might do that, how we might go about that is really another question. It's easy to talk about stuff like this. It's easy to set these things as a goal, to have a New Year's resolution. It's harder to accomplish because, frankly, we have some deeply rooted habits that we have to overcome. But the good news is that we don't have to overcome these things on our own. Paul reminds us in Philippians 4, a passage that we've talked about from time to time, that he has learned the secret to contentment. And that secret is, in his words, I can do all this through him who gives me strength. Reminding us that God's power at work in us can lead us to a life of contentment. And that's probably what it's going to take, God's power working in us, because few of us come by this naturally. Still, for most of us, it won't be as simple as I'm going to pray and I'm going to wait for God to change me. That's not a bad prayer to pray, but God expects action in us as well. He expects us to engage in this struggle as well. And yet here, there's still more good news. Spending less and being more content are actually habits that can be developed. In fact, Paul says earlier in that same passage in Philippians 4, he says, I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. Even with God's help, being content is still learned behavior. And here there are any number of great ideas to help move us down that road as we try to become more aware of God also working in us and moving us in a direction he wants us to go. A few suggestions as we offer this up to God and as we ask for his help. Maybe the most important thing, if you want to spend less, is you need to track your finances. You need to know what you have coming in, and you need to know where your money is going. That seems just breathtakingly obvious, but the truth is, trust me, some of us have no real idea how we're living. Some of us have no real idea how much money we're spending, period, and certainly not how much we're spending foolishly. And this is just, among other things, this is poor stewardship. Once you do that, you can start to do some other things. You can, for instance, you can start to get rid of what they call gray charges. These are the small charges, fees, subscriptions, renewals that you've signed up for that eat up smaller amounts of money that together can add up to significant money. Seriously, you've had a gym membership for 3 years and you have not gone once. It is time to cancel your gym membership and put that money into something else. And how many streaming services do you really need? You could have 10 if you want them. Do you need all of those? Maybe 1 or 2 at a time and then cancel and try something else. But do you have to have all of them going at the same time? And then maybe, pull all those savings together and do something intentional with them. Something you've prayed about, something that you've asked God to guide you in, because, waste is bad stewardship. So let's cut the waste and let's free up those funds for something more productive in the kingdom of God. There's something else we need to, as we try to be more aware, we need to be aware of our impulses. And we live in a moment in culture, and I imagine this is only going to get more intense over time. We live in a moment where great lengths have been pursued to make buying stuff as easy as possible. I can buy books on my Amazon Kindle, my e-reader, by clicking one button. And let me tell you, I frequently click that one button. Amazon lets me subscribe and save. That's the phrase that they use. And so there's stuff that I can sign up for to get a really good price on that maybe I only need once, but I do it through a subscription, and then it just automatically shows up every so often. And, impulse items, they used to be things that you had to put by the cash register, but now they appear in pop-up ads on my computer, on my tablet, on my phone. But we need to learn to resist the easy purchases. When you're browsing online and you find something that you don't need, but it's such a great deal, maybe save it to a wish list for a while. Maybe even title that wish list stuff I really don't need. And then come back in a week or 2 weeks or a month and see if you still really need it. And ask, would I even be considering this purchase if it wasn't just such a great deal in the moment? So we need to know, we need to understand our impulses and how they're used against us. We need to understand that all of us have emotional and psychological triggers that might cause us to spend. We need to know what they are. We need to try to remove them or at least manage them. And so, do I go shopping when I'm depressed? There are other approaches to mental health, which is a very real struggle. There are other approaches that are a lot more productive than buying stuff. Can I not help myself? This is other people, not me. Can I not help myself on Cyber Monday or on Prime Day when there are all these great deals? And if that's me, then you know what, maybe I need to take a tech Sabbath on those days, or maybe go in with a clear shopping list of things that I need and am looking for, not just looking for great deals, and commit that I'm only going to buy these things that I know are necessary. Or, here's a hard one. Are there certain people in your life who you like to have in your life, but when you're with them, they're always outspending you, but you're still kind of trying to keep up with them? Sometimes we have maybe some relationships that we need to rethink. And I'm not saying that those relationships need to go away, but perhaps we need to put them in a different context, put them in different emphasis. Similarly, let's look at what the habits we have are that may be draining our budget. It's sorry, that was just an alarm that popped up on my phone telling me it was time to leave for church, but I'm not leaving for church today. Figure out what habits drain your budget. It's usually not hard to figure this out if you're tracking your money, and then you can evaluate whether or not these habits are really necessary. Am I eating out too much? Am I spending too much on clothes? Do I need to find a cheaper hobby? Those are good questions to ask. And then finally, we need to learn to value saving over stuff. You don't have to spend every dollar that comes in. Sometimes I have to remind myself of that. Just because I have a monthly income doesn't mean I have to spend all that. And in fact, we shouldn't. It's wise not to. Now, the topic of spending is actually kind of strange biblically. The Bible is cautious when it comes to encouraging us to save money because, God is aware that even saving can be something that we might obsess on as well. It can become something we worship. It can become a very selfish pursuit. But on the plus side, biblically, saving gives us options. It helps us to avoid debt and waste. And it opens up possibilities for us to use money in ways that, again, might make a difference in the kingdom. So, some suggestions that might help us as we try to align our spiritual lives with this idea of spending less. And so, this has been part 2 of our Advent 2020 challenge. I guess you could call it that. It's not really what I've been titling this, but I think this is kind of what we're talking about. Some challenges to get started off on the right foot this year. And one of those challenges is let's spend less. Let's spend less not because we have to, but because we choose to. Let's spend less and learn to be content with less. Let's spend less so that we can save more. Let's spend less so that we can give more, which will be a part of our topic of conversation next week. In the meantime, stay safe out there. I look forward to being off the couch, off the office chair, and back with you in person next Sunday.